So in previous sessions, we've talked about the return, Joseph Smith's claim of the return of authority to speak from God. In fact, as we've explored, there's both the prophetic way in which the heavens are open, but there's also a personal revelation, or at least an expectation that individual LDS members can receive personal revelation from the Holy Ghost. So what do we make of that claim? And I wanted to speak a little bit about the different kind of scriptures and assessing their authenticity and what can we say about them. And I wanted to mention a few things. First of all, very early, in as early as 1830, there was a group of people that began to operate independent of Joseph Smith's authority in receiving revelations. And Hiram Page, it was said, had a stack of revelations that he had received from a stone, much like Joseph Smith received the Book of Mormon through looking at what he called a peep stone or seer stone. And this was challenging to Smith's authority, because now you have somebody else who's claiming to receive revelation the very way he did, and so create new doctrine and new practices. Joseph Smith, how does he respond to that? Well, Doctrine and Covenants 28 verse 2 says, "But behold, verily, verily, I say unto thee, that no one shall be appointed to receive commandments and revelations in this church, excepting my servant Joseph Smith, Jr., for he receiveth them even as Moses." And then in verse 11, "And again, thou shalt take thy brother Hiram Page between him and thee alone, and tell him these things which he hath written from the stone are not from me, and that Satan deceiveth him." And so Joseph Smith very early recognized that the theology he was creating was going to create just a mix, a jumble, and a power grab that anybody could say anything was from God. And so he has to say very quickly, very early, that no, you actually can't get revelation like me. And so he kind of establishes himself then as the revelatory nexus through which everything will flow. And the LDS Church has operated that way since, that the prophet, those that they ordain as prophet, seer, and revelator have the ability to create doctrine. The rest of us don't have that same ability, although the heavens are open in the sense that we can ask God for a testimony that what the prophets are saying is true. So Joseph Smith gives us a list of covenants and prophetic words. Some of those are recorded for us in the scriptures. Doctrine and Covenants 13, 1 Nephi 13 is a prime example of that, where he says the church will allow for the corrupting of the Christian scriptures. I think that is a claim that we can assess today. We can look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. We can see that the Book of the Jews was not corrupted after the time of Jesus and the apostles. That's something that we can assess clearly. I think also we can assess some of his own revelations. In fact, even in 1835, some of the early followers were a little troubled by the fact that Joseph Smith was going back and changing some of his own revelations that he had written down for them. So in the Book of Commandments in 1833, and then in the publication of the Doctrine and Covenants in 1835, there were significant changes that were made that even one of the apostles, David Whitmer, pointed out were very troubling to him. When Joseph Smith first reported a revelation that he had received even back in 1829, he said that the Book of Mormon was the only gift that God would give him, implying that the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith's bringing forth of the Book of Mormon was his prime, or at least his only gift that that's what God was using him for. But in 1835, he was already claiming to be correcting the Christian scriptures. He had already received the papyrus that he would then translate into the Book of Abraham. And so that claim that the Book of Mormon was the only gift wouldn't work for him anymore. And so in 1835, when they republished those commandments in the Doctrine and Covenants, he changed that revelation to say, instead of it was the only gift, to say it is the first gift. And so we can see that he himself didn't even have a lot of trouble going back and revising the old revelations of God in order to suit his purposes. In the Bible, Jesus warned that false prophets would come. And several other places warn us about false prophets and spiritual deception. We can see that in 1 Timothy 4. It says that the Spirit expressly states that in the latter times some will depart from the faith and devote themselves to deceitful spirits, the teachings of demons. 2 Peter 2, 1-3, 1 John 4, Jude 3 through 16, all talk about people who will come in and distort the teachings of God. And so we should not be surprised if we find false prophets speaking in the world. So how do I discover or discern if someone is a false prophet? One of the things that the LDS church missionaries are going to want to do is have you pray and ask God if if you feel the teachings of the church are true. And I don't have a big problem with somebody praying and asking God if something is true, but I think it's a little bit like in this sense, it'd be a little bit like if praying and asking if it's okay with God that I murder somebody. Of course not. Why? And how do I know that it would never be okay for me to murder somebody? Because God's already told me that it's not okay. And in a similar way, one of the things that God has already told us is how to assess a prophet. And it's not praying and asking him if it's true, but it's judging what they have said. And so one of the ways that we can assess or figure out some thinking of how we should understand Joseph Smith and his prophecy is by just looking at some of the things that he has said and asking ourselves, did those things that he spoke prophetically come to pass? And so there's a host of things, a host of places where he has spoken definitively about something that would happen in the finite future that haven't happened, and some of those are important for us to take a look at. Deuteronomy 18:20-22 tells us that we, if someone claims to be speaking for God, we just look at look at what they've said, and if it comes to pass, then we can trust them. If it doesn't come to pass, then we don't need to trust them. One of the things that Joseph Smith has said is that in a meeting in 1835 where the LDS 12 apostles were first chosen, he had said that the coming of the Lord would come even 56 years, would wind up the scene. Of course, it's been a lot longer than 56 years, and Christ hasn't come back. In 1832, he claimed that a war would start in South Carolina that would spread to all nations, Doctrine and Covenants 87, and though the Civil War did begin and even is thought to have started in South Carolina, that war did not spread to all nations as he claimed it would. In History of the Church 5, Volume 5, page 394, it's reported that he claimed that the U.S. government would be overthrown if they did not redress the wrongs committed in Missouri. Of course, that didn't happen. Doctrine and Covenants 114, he says that David Patton would go on a mission with the other 12 apostles. And of course that didn't happen either. He died before that mission trip with those other apostles could take place. Doctrine and Covenants 84 is a prophecy Joseph Smith gave that they would build a temple on a lot that he had dedicated in Missouri. That's dated to 1832, that prophecy. And of course, that's still never happened even to this day. It's an empty lot. So we can assess some of the claims of Joseph Smith that way, but what do we make of the personal testimony? What do we do with somebody who claims that they were unsure if this church is true, and they asked God and they felt that burning in the bosom, or they felt that peace of God that gave them the indication that this church is true? And there's probably a lot of ways that you can deal with this. I think for me, the primary way that I try to deal with that person's testimony of the church is I'll ask them what they would do if their daughter one day were to come to them and say, hey, I met this man at the grocery store, and he claimed to be a prophet of God, and he said that I need to join his polygamous suicide cult, and if I did that, I'd reach the highest level of heaven. And of course, your daughter says, well, of course I didn't believe him, but he said just to pray about it and ask God, and if it's true, he'll tell me. And what would you do if your daughter then said, and so I did, I prayed and I asked God, and I felt that God told me it was true. In fact, it's more sure than I've ever felt about anything in my life that God was telling me that. And then I'll ask, well, what would you say to her about that? And I'm hoping the person loves their daughter enough to say, I would not say to join the group. And typically I'll get something like, well, God wouldn't say that. Or I would tell her to pray some more. And so, okay, yeah, sure, she prayed some more. And God again reaffirms it in powerful, peaceful, and burning bosom-ish ways. And so then we'll ask, okay, so then, so if they keep praying and keep getting the same answer, what do you say to them? And well, typically I'll get an answer like, well, God wouldn't say that. And I'll ask them, now, how do you know God wouldn't say that? Why wouldn't God say that? Typically they'll give me something like, well, because God has already told us something about his church and how it operates. And so that gives me a great chance to pause for a minute and say, so you actually think that the written scriptures can judge or sit in judgment over our personal subjective feelings? And if they agree to that, that's a fantastic entry point, because then we can affirm and say, I wholeheartedly agree with you on that. And it just so happens that Deuteronomy 18 gives us one of those places where we can judge and assess a prophet and do so in a way that does justice to their prophetic career and whether or not they're from God, not based on a subjective feeling, but on an external test that God gives.